What would you do if you had to fight the same battle for 17 years? Not 17 battles, one battle. The same trenches, the same bunkers, the same scorched earth. For 17 years straight, no rotation, no leave, no end in sight. Just artillery bombardment, poison gas, and watching your comrades die in the mud while you gain maybe 100 meters of ground, if you're lucky. That's the Siege of Vraks. An Imperial fortress world rebelled against the Imperium. The Death Korps of Krieg, an entire army corps of clone soldiers bred for trench warfare, was sent to bring it back into compliance. They expected it to take a few months, maybe a year. It took 17 years, 14 million soldiers dead, the entire planet reduced to a radioactive wasteland. And the Death Korps didn't care, because caring isn't what they were designed for. This is the story of the longest siege in Imperial history. A meat grinder that consumed armies, a war where victory meant dying slightly, slower than the enemy, and a reminder that in Warhammer 40K, even winning looks like losing. Vraks before the fall. Okay, so let's start with what Vraks actually was. Because before it became a 17-year hellscape, it was one of the Imperium's most important worlds. Vraks was a fortress world in the Scarus sector. Its entire purpose was to store military equipment for the Imperium's wars across the region. We're talking mountains of ammunition, stockpiles of weapons, entire warehouses full of tanks and artillery pieces. If the Imperium needed to launch a campaign anywhere in the sector, they'd pull supplies from Vraks. The planet's surface was covered in fortifications, massive citadels, underground bunkers, defense laser batteries that could shoot down entire fleets, void shields protecting the most critical installations, and garrisoning all of this, the Vraks militia. Planetary defense forces, not the Imperial Guard, but well-trained and well-equipped. Vraks wasn't just defended. It was one of the most heavily fortified worlds in the Imperium. Taking it by force would be a nightmare, which is why the Imperium never worried about it rebelling. Until it did. The Cardinal Governor of Vraks was a man named Xaphan. Officially, he was the planet's spiritual leader, overseeing the ecclesiarchy, the Imperial Church on Vraks. But Xaphan had a problem. He'd been passed over for promotion to the archdeacon of the entire sector. Someone else got the job, someone he thought was less worthy. And Xaphan, he took it personally. Now, a normal person might grumble and move on. But Xaphan started questioning the Imperium's authority, started wondering if the ecclesiarchy on distant Terra actually understood the Emperor's will, started believing that he, Cardinal Xaphan, understood the Emperor better than anyone else. And then he started hearing voices. Chaos corruption doesn't always come with tentacles and mutations. Sometimes it's subtle, a whisper in your prayers, a feeling that you're the only one who truly understands, a growing certainty that everyone else is wrong and you're right. Xaphan fell to chaos, slowly, quietly. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. He declared Vraks independent from the Imperium, said the ecclesiarchy on Terra had lost its way, that he and his followers were the true believers, that Vraks would become a sanctuary for those who still understood the Emperor's will. The Imperium's response was simple: bring Vraks back into compliance, by force. The Death Korps of Krieg, an army built for this. The Imperium needed an army to retake Vraks, and they chose the Death Korps of Krieg. If you don't know about Krieg, here's what you need to understand. It's a death world, literally. The entire planet is a radioactive wasteland, the result of a civil war 500 years ago, where the Loyalists nuked their own world to stop the rebels. The survivors live in underground hive cities, wearing gas masks to breathe, never seeing the sun. And they've spent the last 5 centuries atoning for their ancestors' rebellion by sending every able-bodied person to the Imperial Guard. The Death Korps of Krieg aren't just soldiers, they're penitents, cloned in vat factories, raised from birth to believe their only purpose is to die for the Emperor. They don't value their own lives, they don't expect to survive, and they excel at one thing above all else: siege warfare, trench fighting, artillery duels, grinding attrition, the kind of warfare where you measure progress in meters and casualties in millions. The Death Korps doesn't just accept this, they prefer it. It's what they were designed for. When the Departmentum Munitorum, the Imperium's military bureaucracy, looked at Vraks and realized it would be a siege, they assigned the Death Korps, 12 million soldiers in the first wave alone, siege engineers, artillery regiments, trench fighters bred for endurance. The Lord Marshal commanding the operation estimated the siege would take 6 months, maybe a year if the rebels put up serious resistance. It took 17 years, because the Death Korps was good at siege warfare, but Vraks was designed to withstand sieges. And Cardinal Xaphan had something the Imperium didn't expect: help from chaos. Not just corruption, actual reinforcements. Chaos Space Marines, demons, traitor guard regiments from other fallen worlds. The ruinous powers saw Vraks as an opportunity to humiliate the Imperium, and they poured resources into keeping the rebellion alive. The Death Korps didn't care. They'd been told to take Vraks, so they started digging trenches. And the meat grinder began. The first years, digging in and dying. The Death Korps landed on Vraks and immediately started building siege lines, trenches, artillery positions, forward operating bases. They surrounded the primary hive city and the main fortress complexes and settled in for a long fight. The plan was simple: bombardment and attrition. Shell the enemy positions. Advance when you can. Force the rebels to waste ammunition and manpower defending. Eventually, they'd run out of supplies and surrender. But Vraks had been a munitions stockpile world. They had more ammunition than the Death Korps did, way more. And Cardinal Xaphan wasn't planning to surrender. He'd fortified the cities, dug underground bunkers connected by tunnel networks, set up killing fields where any Imperial advance would be slaughtered by crossfire. And his Vraxian militia was dug in, ready to hold every inch of ground. The first major assault came early. The Death Korps threw an entire corps at the outer defenses, hundreds of thousands of soldiers charging across. No man's land under artillery fire. They made it to the enemy trenches. They fought hand-to-hand in the bunkers. They died by the tens of thousands, and they gained maybe 5 kilometers of ground. The Death Korps commanders looked at the casualty reports and shrugged. Acceptable losses? Keep advancing. So they did. For months. Throwing wave after wave of soldiers at fortified positions, dying in droves, gaining ground so slowly that you could measure it in meters per day. And the Vraxian defenders, they held. Because they believed Cardinal Xaphan's message. They thought they were the true faithful, that the Imperium had fallen to corruption, and they were the only ones defending the Emperor's will. Both sides thought they were fighting for the Emperor. Both sides were willing to die for it. And chaos laughed. By the end of the first year, the Death Korps had lost 2 million soldiers. They'd advanced maybe 20 kilometers. At this rate, it would take decades to reach the main fortress. The Imperium sent reinforcements, another 5 million soldiers, more artillery, Titan legions. They were committed now. The siege continued. Chaos joins the fight. The siege gets worse. Year 3. The Death Korps was making slow progress, grinding forward, dying, but winning. And then chaos showed up in force. A fleet appeared in orbit, traitor ships. They broke through the Imperial blockade, or what was left of it, and started landing reinforcements on Vraks. Chaos Space Marines from the Skulltaker's warband. Cornate berserkers who worshipped the blood god through slaughter. Traitor guard regiments from other fallen worlds. The defenders of Vraks suddenly had reinforcements. Superhuman warriors who didn't just hold the line, they counterattacked. The Death Korps found themselves fighting Chaos Space Marines in the trenches. And here's the thing. Death Korps soldiers are incredible. Disciplined. Fearless. Willing to die without hesitation. But they're still human. And Chaos Space Marines are not. A single berserker could tear through an entire squad before going down. Daemon-possessed champions shrugged off lasgun fire that would kill normal men. The trenches turned into slaughterhouses. And the Death Korps? They adapted, started using massed artillery to soften up chaos positions before assaulting, deployed heavy flamers to burn berserkers out of bunkers, accepted that every meter of ground would cost hundreds of lives and kept pushing anyway. The Imperium responded by sending even more reinforcements. Skitari from the Adeptus Mechanicus, Sisters of Battle, Inquisitors to root out chaos corruption, Space Marines, loyalists this time, to counter the traitor Astartes. Vraks stopped being a simple siege. It became a war of attrition between the Imperium and chaos. And the Death Korps was stuck in the middle, bleeding for every trench, every bunker, every square kilometer of radioactive mud. By year 5, the Death Korps had lost 6 million soldiers, half the original army. The Imperium had sent replacements, always more replacements, but the casualty rate was unsustainable. Except the Death Korps didn't see it that way. To them, casualties were just numbers. You kept fighting until you won or until everyone was dead, preferably both. And so, the siege continued. The meat grinder, life and death in the trenches. Let's talk about what it was actually like to fight on Vraks. Because this wasn't glorious battle, this was industrial-scale slaughter. The trenches on Vraks stretched for hundreds of kilometers, zigzagging lines of mud and corpses. Some trenches were so old that bodies had been buried in the walls, literally built into the fortifications because there was no time to move them. Death Korps soldiers lived in these trenches, slept in dugouts carved into the mud, ate rations that tasted like ash, breathed through gas masks because the air was filled with poison and radiation. And every day, the artillery bombardment, constant, relentless. Shells falling from both sides, the ground shaking, soldiers going deaf from the noise, trenches collapsing and burying men alive. When the shelling stopped, that's when you knew an assault was coming. Either you were about to go over the top and charge enemy lines, or the enemy was about to charge yours. Death Korps soldiers didn't fear death. That was the point. They'd been conditioned to see dying for the Emperor as the highest honor. So, when the whistle blew and the order came to advance, they climbed out of the trenches and walked into no man's land. Not ran, walked, in perfect formation. While enemy machine guns and artillery tore them apart, the Death Korps philosophy was simple. If you advance steadily and never break, eventually the enemy runs out of bullets. Eventually, you reach their trench. And then, it's bayonets and shovels and hand-to-hand combat in the mud. And it worked. Slowly, at horrific cost. But it worked. The Vraksian defenders fought just as hard. They had the advantage of fortifications, but they were running low on supplies. Ammunition was still plentiful. Vraks had stockpiles for decades, but food, medicine, and morale were breaking down. Chaos kept them going. The promise of dark gods, the belief that they were righteous, the mutations creeping into their ranks that made them stronger, tougher, more willing to fight. By year 10, Vraks wasn't a planet anymore. It was a graveyard. The surface was cratered, the cities were ruins. Radiation levels were lethal. The only thing that mattered was the trenches, and both sides kept fighting. Titans in escalation when the war gets even worse. Year 12. The Imperium decided to escalate. They'd been sending reinforcements for over a decade. Millions of soldiers, artillery regiments, armored companies. But the siege was still grinding on, the Death Korps was still dying, and the Departamento Munitorum looked at the casualty reports and realized, at this rate, they'd run out of soldiers before Vraks fell. So they sent Titans, not just a few, entire Titan legions, god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, warlord-class Titans standing 30 meters tall, armed with weapons that could level city blocks, Reaver-class Titans and Warhound scouts supporting them. The plan? Smash through the fortifications, break the siege lines, end this war. And for a while, it worked. Titans striding across the battlefield, void shields shrugging off artillery, plasma annihilators turning bunkers into molten slag. The Death Korps advanced behind them, finally making real progress, until chaos responded with Titans of their own. Corrupted, god machines, demon-possessed war engines, Titans that had turned traitor 10,000 years ago during the Horus Heresy, now fighting for the ruinous powers on Vraks. Titan combat isn't like normal warfare. It's apocalyptic. Weapons that can crack continents firing at point-blank range, void shields colliding, the ground melting under their feet. And when Titans fall, they don't just die, they explode, plasma reactors going critical, taking entire companies of soldiers with them. The Death Korps watched god machines taller than buildings tear each other apart, and then went back to advancing through the trenches. Because that's what they did. The Titan War raged for months. Both sides lost dozens of war engines. The landscape was reshaped by their battles. Craters the size of cities. Entire fortresses obliterated. But the siege didn't end. Because even with Titans, you still had to take the fortresses. You still had to clear the bunkers. You still had to dig the enemy out of their holes. And that required soldiers, millions of them, dying in the mud. The Death Korps kept fighting. The final push, 17 years later. Year 17. The end was finally in sight. The Death Korps had bled for nearly 2 decades, 14 million soldiers dead. Entire regiments wiped out and replaced. Some trenches had been fought over so many times that the original soldiers who dug them were long dead, and their replacements were dead, and their replacements' replacements were dead. But the Imperium was winning, slowly, meter by meter. The fortifications were falling. The Vraxian defenders were running out of supplies. Finally, Chaos reinforcements had stopped coming. The traitor Titans were destroyed. Cardinal Xaphan, the man who started this whole nightmare, was still alive, still preaching, still believing he was right. But he was losing. The Death Korps launched a final assault on the main fortress complex. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, artillery bombardment for weeks straight. And then the order came. Take the fortress. They went over the top, one last time, through the killing fields, over the corpses of everyone who died before them, into the bunkers. The fighting inside the fortress was brutal, room to room, hand to hand, flamers burning out every corridor, chaos cultists fighting to the last man because they had nowhere left to run. And then, finally, the Death Korps reached the inner sanctum, where Cardinal Xaphan had barricaded himself. He was there, alone, mutated by years of chaos corruption, still clutching his holy symbols, still believing he was righteous. The Death Korps shot him, burned the body, and raised the imperial aquila over the ruins. The Siege of Vraks was over. 17 years, 14 million dead. The entire planet reduced to a lifeless radioactive wasteland. Victory. What was left? So, what did the Imperium win? A dead planet. The cities were ruins. The fortresses were rubble. The munitions stockpiles, the entire reason Vraks mattered, had been used up during the siege or destroyed in the fighting. Vraks was worthless. It would take centuries to decontaminate, longer to rebuild. The Imperium had spent 17 years and 14 million lives to reclaim a world that would never be useful again. But that's not how the Imperium saw it. To the Departamento Munitorum, Vraks was a success. A rebellious world had been brought back into compliance. Chaos had been defeated. The Emperor's will had been enforced. The casualty reports? Acceptable. The Death Korps had done its job. And if they'd all died doing it, well, that's what they were for. The survivors of the Death Korps, what few there were reassigned to other war zones, sent to die on other worlds, because that's what the Death Korps does. And Vraks, it was garrisoned by a skeleton crew and left to rot. Monument to imperial stubbornness, a reminder that the Imperium doesn't retreat, doesn't negotiate, doesn't accept defeat, even if victory costs everything. The meaning of Vraks. So that's the Siege of Vraks. 17 years, 14 million dead, a planet destroyed, all to prove a point. And here's the thing. Vraks wasn't unique. It's just the most famous example of what the Imperium does. Across the galaxy, there are thousands of sieges like this. Worlds that rebel, armies sent to bring them back, soldiers dying in trenches for years, decades, sometimes centuries. The Death Korps of Krieg is the perfect metaphor for the Imperium, an army of clones bred to die without question. No individuality, no hope, just obedience and attrition. And it works. The Imperium wins. Eventually, at horrific cost. But it wins. Because in Warhammer 40K, that's what victory looks like. Not triumph, not glory. Just outlasting the enemy. Being willing to sacrifice more than they are. Grinding them down until there's nothing left. Vraks was a meat grinder, And the Imperium fed soldiers into it for 17 years because giving up would have been worse. Because if one world can rebel and get away with it, others will try. And the Imperium can't afford that. So they make examples. They turn rebellious worlds into graveyards, and they make sure everyone knows if you defy the Imperium, this is what happens. You die. Your world dies. And the Imperium raises its banner over the ashes. That's the Siege of Vraks. That's the Imperium. That's Warhammer 40K. In the grim darkness of the far future, even winning is just another way to die.